World War II is over. And as the new superpowers rise across the earth, a new generation of talents, those born with superpowers, have stood forward to help change and shape the history of a mad world. I'm Big Mike, and this is the tutorial for Wild Talents 2nd edition. Wild Talents, developed by Cubicle 7, uses the one roll engine, which is a particular type of dice roll system that uses one roll, not only just to determine whether or not you succeed or fail at challenges, but also for everything that happens in combat or just in general. You only ever use one kind of roll at all times. But in order to explain that, I have to explain how stats and skills work. In Wild Talents, you use a point-buy system to build your character. And this determines everything, your stats, your skills, your powers, as well as all the different systems that work to make your character possible and round out their personality and features. Now, I'm only going to cover certain parts of these, so let's start at the very top with stats. Stats are the base innate abilities of your character, and these are body, coordination, sense, mind, charm, and command. And of course, each one has their own set skills with them that you pair for your dice rolls to determine whether or not you will succeed or fail. For example, if you make an athletics check, you're always going to be rolling it with your body stat to decide whether you succeed or fail. For this system, much like White Wolf, you roll 1d10 for the combined total between your stat and skill. That would be your total dice pool for the check you need to make. Unlike White Wolf, however, to succeed, you need two numbers within that dice pool to be the same. Naturally, the higher that number is, the better it is. But to explain that more, I have to go into the concept of height and width. I know. To explain it simply, the idea is that the higher the value of the pair for your dice roll is, so let's say you got double 9s as opposed to double 4s, the more powerful that result will be. So let's say you're looking to kick down a door, double 4s might break the lock, double 9s might take the door completely off of its hinges. Now with width, the more dice that match the paired number, the faster that action happens. So going back to our previous example, that pair of 9s will hit harder, but let's say we had 3 4s as opposed to 2. Those 3 4s will happen sooner than the pair of 9s, despite the fact that the pair of 9s will hit way harder. Typically, when you declare a result, you list the width by the height. So let's say you, when you rolled your dice pool, saw the number 4 come up 3 times. You would list that 3 by 4. Simple. So, in short, sometimes the key to victory is not how long you are, but how thick. Why did I write that? Either way, your dice pool can never have more than 10 dice in it, even if the combination of skill and stat would allow you to do so. Conversely, though, there are circumstances within the game that allow your dice pool to be reduced, so it just means your pool of 10 will be preserved if you go above that in the combined stat and skill. The GM can also assign a difficulty to a dice roll, meaning that your pair must at least match that difficulty rating to succeed, the highest, of course, being 9. Which is not impossible in terms of difficulty. If you fail to get a pair and all of your dice are under 5 in value, that failure is considered a botch and the GM gets to tell you what happened, usually for some kind of lasting circumstance. If you don't get a pair but many of your dice remain high of value and the circumstances dictate that you should have been able to succeed, the GM can decide to let you have that success. Anyway, it just may take more time, or he might put some other conditions on that, depending on what your highest value dice roll was. This is what's known as loose dice. However, you can buy things called wiggle and hard dice, and why is this so sexual? Am I the pervert? Is it just me? Hush you. Wiggle dice and hard dice, can't say that without laughing, are a type of dice that you can buy at character creation. Hard dice are dice that will always show a value of 10 regardless of your roll. So if you have 2, you basically will always be doing really well at that roll, but you'll also always be doing the maximum possible outcome that that roll could do. So if you want to do something maybe a little bit weaker, you can't. You will always be doing your max amount of force for that check, which is a problem for a superhero game. So if we're going back to our locked door example, you might not knock down the door. You may rip out the wall entirely. So it's not great. Conversely, wiggle dice are whatever value you want them to be for that roll. You change their facing after the roll to match the best outcome for you or a weaker outcome for you if that's your preference. No catch, they're just more expensive. Now, we explain willpower. In short, you have a score called base will, which is determined by other stats that you have on your character sheet. It also determines your starting willpower. Now, while your base will won't change that much, your willpower will go up and down throughout the course of the game, and how high or low it is determines how successful you are at accessing your powers, and some powers require the use of willpower. It depends. Basically, it's better just to keep it higher. Of course, you can always replenish your willpower through role-playing, depending on how your character's motivations are and how your character is constructed accordingly. A big part of your character creation is in archetypes, which is really just an umbrella term for the different places your powers come from and how they tie into your origin. But the system does allow you to mix and match as you see fit, as well as having some pre-built archetypes, so it's really open for you to create what you want. First, you buy a source for your power. Then, you decide what kind of powers that source gives you, which is called permissions, and then it branches down to individual categories of unique qualities called intrinsic meta qualities, and then it just keeps branching into the specific powers. It's very large, and while it sounds complex, it's actually relatively simple once you look at it within the book through character creation, and as long as you have a competent DM explaining it to you. Powers themselves are easy to explain. There's 3 kinds. The first 2 are hyperstats and hyperskills, and each of them are added on to your normal stats and skills, and they are used as for normal rolls, but they let you do things on a much higher magnitude, such as the difference between lifting a trash can and lifting a truck. The last is miracles, which don't fit into the normal stat and skill roll because they're too distinct and don't really fit into those categories. Things like turning invisible or having laser eyes. And now, combat. There are 3 phases to normal combat in Wild Talents. First is declaration, which is determined by a player's sense stat. The player with the lowest sense stat declares what they want to do first, and it proceeds upwards from there. The idea is that players with a higher sense stat can choose to react to what's happening around them accordingly. You can also choose to block or dodge as your action, depending on what's appropriate and depending on what attacks are being sent in your direction. Then, in the second phase, all players roll their pools for the appropriate action of which they chose to take. Then, in the third phase, resolution, order of actions happening is determined by the width and height of the rolls made by the players. This means that if you chose to dodge an attack, but the attack hit you before you took your dodge action, you still get hit by good old-fashioned girth. Now, at this point, you might be wondering how damage works. Damage is determined by the same dice roll you make your attack with, actually. Let's go back to a previous example, where you got the number 3 to occur 4 times, otherwise 4 by 3 for that attack roll. For that roll, the width determines how much damage you get, while the height determines where on your opponent's body that damage hit. This is represented by a handy chart on the character sheet. The more damage you take, the more you fill in for that section of that chart. If a limb is filled with damage, it's taken out of commission. With legs, it's less movement or no movement if both legs are taken out, whereas arms, you can no longer take action with that respective arm. In the case of your head or your torso, you're taken out or take penalties depending on the damage type you take, which I'll explain. Now, this system uses 2 types of damage, shock and killing, which is determined by the type of the attack. In the case of a punch, which would be shock damage, and a knife, which would be killing damage. Naturally, if your head is full of shock damage, you're knocked out, but if it's filled with killing damage, you are dead. If your torso is filled with shock damage, you take certain penalties, and if it's filled with killing damage, you are also dead. Limbs that are filled with killing damage are dealt severe penalties accordingly depending on the damage, but they're considered lasting damage on your character. And that was Wild Talents 2nd Edition. It's a unique take on the superhero RPG, and I encourage you to check it out for yourself. If not, you'll just have to catch us playing it on the next D20 live stream. Until then, I'm Big Mike, this is a tutorial, and keep having fun.